The fog had rolled in early that morning, soft and pale as worn lace, drifting across the Seine until the bridges looked as though they floated above an unseen depth. Inspector Moreau had risen before dawn, restless without knowing why, and walked the length of the Quai des Orfèvres with the vague sensation that the city was holding its breath. Paris often whispered secrets through its chimneys and shutters, but on that particular morning the silence felt deliberate, almost staged, like the hush inside a theatre just before the curtain lifts. Moreau had paused in front of a gallery near the Pont Saint-Michel, its windows faintly lit by the glow of a kerosene lamp within, and something in the display made him step closer. There, framed in dark walnut and set at a slight angle as though she were turning toward him, was a woman's portrait, so lifelike, so strangely alert that he felt a chill as if he had seen a ghost. Her gaze followed him with unnerving precision, and her expression carried an unspoken plea he could not yet decipher. Hours later, when the telegram arrived, summoning him to a peculiar disappearance in the 6th arrondissement, he already suspected, without reason, without evidence, that the case would lead back to that haunting painted face. Stories like this one have a way of tightening around the viewer the same way the Paris fog tightens around the old stone bridges. If mysteries that lace themselves through art, psychology, and the quiet corners of the city intrigue you, then allow yourself to settle in. And while we walk together through the alleyways and hidden rooms of this investigation, feel free to join this growing circle of listeners by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with anyone who revels in stories where the boundary between observation and intuition grows thin. It helps the channel more than you know, and keeps these lantern-lit journeys alive. The tale you're about to experience unfolds across 8 chapters, each deepening the world around Inspector Moreau as he navigates a disappearance tangled in whispers, old canvases, and the peculiar shadows cast by human longing. In the opening chapter, the rhythm of Paris will carry us into Moreau's first encounter with the mystery. A missing young woman whose landlady insists she vanished into a painting. Moreau, grounded as ever in the facts, nevertheless feels the quiet tug of intuition as clues surface in unexpected places. A misplaced brush, a scent of turpentine, a neighbor who heard footsteps descending the stairs long after midnight. As we proceed through the early chapters, the story narrows to the intimate details Moreau excels at noticing. The faint indentation of a chair, the cold dregs of coffee in a chipped cup, the murmur of gossip in a smoky cafe on Rue Bonaparte. Witnesses contradict themselves. A painter who claims to know nothing glances too quickly at a locked drawer. Lucas finds a scrap of linen with a single stroke of blue pigment, one that does not match any palette, in the missing woman's room. Moreau's inner world grows heavier with each hour, though he never announces it. Simenon's detectives never do. Instead, the weight appears in the way he presses his thumb to the bridge of his nose or pauses before answering a question. By the time we reach the middle of the tale, the fog of Paris thickens and the rumors thicken with it. A journalist at a riverside cafe claims the missing woman once modeled for an artist who locked his completed canvases in an attic and refused to sell them. The concierge whispers that she saw someone slip into the courtyard holding a rolled canvas under their arm. Moreau suspects the truth lies somewhere between recollection and invention, but each discrepancy pushes the boundaries of what he believes possible. He begins to sense that the portrait he saw at dawn is not merely a coincidence, but a quiet warning. In the later chapters, the narrative expands into broader implications, always grounded, always canon-safe, but reflective of the way society can absorb a mystery and reshape it into something stranger. Papers speculate about an art cult rumored to operate in the cafes of Montparnasse, while provincial police send telegrams describing a traveling exhibition that features portraits too uncanny to be ordinary works. Moreau does not indulge the sensationalism, yet he follows each lead with the patience and quiet resolve that define him. The tension between truth and rumor becomes its own character in the story, shaping how each witness speaks and how each clue is interpreted. Ultimately, the final chapters will draw Moreau into an attic room where dust motes float like suspended snow and where a secret many years old waits behind a sheeted easel. But before we step into that shadowed room, we will walk through the full arc. 8 chapters of atmosphere, detail, doubt, intuition, and the strange human truths that emerge when art becomes a vessel for longing. Here is your chapter breakdown, written with cinematic rhythm and poetic restraint, offering only the emotional contour of each stage without revealing the heart of the mystery. Inspector Moreau had always believed that certain mornings arrived already carrying a story within them, as though the city itself had turned the page during the night and the new paragraph waited in the air for someone perceptive enough to read it. That morning, when he stepped onto the Quai des Orfèvres, the sky was still a deep, muted blue, the color that exists only before sunrise when Paris feels both suspended and eternal. The fog curled low over the river, sliding past the arches of the Pont Saint-Michel like a slow exhale. Moreau paused, absorbing that silence that belongs only to the hour before the first café shutters rise. He tightened the collar of his coat, though the chill biting at him was not the kind that came from cold. It was the kind that comes from something unspoken brushing gently against the edge of the mind. He had not planned to deviate from his routine, but his feet carried him along the embankment, drawn by a faint glow that pulsed from a gallery window across the street. At this hour, most shops were still asleep, their doors locked, their lamps snuffed out. Yet this one space glimmered with the weak flame of a kerosene lamp burning behind a patchy curtain. Moreau's curiosity tightened its grip, subtle but insistent. He crossed the quiet street, feeling the echo of his own footsteps ricochet softly against the stone facades on either side. When he reached the gallery, its windows clouded by the breath of cold air, he leaned slightly to peer inside and felt the strange, immediate certainty that his day had already changed. Her eyes were the first thing he noticed. Not the brushstrokes, nor the texture of the canvas, nor even the composition that placed her half in shadow as though she were emerging from a doorway he could not see. Her eyes, painted with unnerving precision, seemed to watch him from the moment he approached. The portrait was angled only slightly toward the window, yet her gaze followed him with a subtlety that felt intentional. She was a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with a calm expression that carried something Moreau could not immediately identify. It was not fear, nor was it sadness or defiance. It was closer to quiet endurance, like someone holding her breath during a moment too fragile to disturb. Moreau stepped back, unsettled by the sense that the painted woman was observing him rather than the other way around. A faint thread of unease wound itself around his ribs. He had seen thousands of portraits in his life, from the grand salons to the modest studios of young artists struggling to earn enough for supper. But this one lingered in the air like an unspoken remark. He waited a few moments, expecting the sensation to pass. It did not. Instead, the sense of being seen deepened, almost warmed, as though she recognized him. He allowed himself a quiet exhalation, half amused at his own reaction, but the feeling did not lift. It was only when a delivery cart rumbled across the distant bridge that he pulled himself away from the window. He had no business standing before a closed gallery, like a man looking for omens and paint. Yet as he walked away, he felt her gaze remain on him, like a hand laid gently on the back of his coat. He pushed the thought aside and continued toward the central office, the familiar stone facade of the Quai des Orfèvres, rising out of the mist like a ship appearing on the horizon. Inside, the warmth of the building met him with the thick smell of stale coffee and pipe smoke. At this hour, only a few officers were present, moving slowly through their early routines. Lucas nodded from behind a stack of papers, his eyes still heavy with sleep. Janvier muttered a greeting while rubbing his temples, the result of a late night, spent working on a burglary case. Moreau set his hat on the table with a soft thud and began reviewing a set of reports from the previous day, but his concentration faltered. He saw the painted woman's face each time he blinked. The telegram arrived a short while later, carried in by a junior officer who wore the uncertain expression of someone interrupting a superior. Moreau unfolded the thin sheet of paper and read the slanted handwriting, noting the urgency pressed into each letter. A young woman residing on Rue des Fossés Saint-Jacques had gone missing under circumstances her landlady described as impossible. Moreau frowned at the phrasing. When telegrams used words like impossible, absurd, or inexplicable, they tended to mask emotions rather than facts. He folded the paper, slipped it into his inner coat pocket, and headed for the door with the quiet efficiency that defined him. The fog had thickened by the time he reached the address, settling heavily between the narrow trees and the iron balconies of the 6th arrondissement. The landlady, a short, wiry woman named Madame Leclerc, met him at the entrance, her hair pinned in a haphazard knot, as though she'd thrown it together the moment she heard footsteps on the stairs. She clutched her shawl tightly and ushered him inside, her anxiety palpable even in the dim light of the corridor. "She vanished, Monsieur l'Inspecteur," she whispered, glancing repeatedly toward the staircase as though expecting someone to overhear. "Vanished in a way I can't explain. I know what I saw, and I have not lost my wits." Moreau's expression remained steady, patient. "Tell me what happened." Madame Leclerc led him up the creaking staircase, each step releasing a faint groan as though the building itself were troubled. She paused at the landing, hesitant to speak until they were fully inside the missing woman's apartment. When she opened the door, the faint smell of lavender drifted out, mingling with something sharper, turpentine. The air felt strangely charged, almost expectant. The room struck Moreau immediately as one that had been left mid-breath. A teacup rested on the small wooden table by the window, half filled, its contents cold. A coat lay draped over a chair, not carelessly, but as though it had been placed there by habit. The bed was neatly made, save for a small indentation near the edge, suggesting someone had sat there for a long time. Nothing in the space was overturned or disrupted. It was the quiet order of someone who had stepped out for an errand, not someone fleeing or taken. "What made you believe she vanished?" Moreau asked. Madame Leclerc swallowed, her fingers tightening on her shawl. "You will think me foolish, but I swear on my mother's grave, I saw her walk into the painting." Moreau felt the words strike him with uncomfortable familiarity. His mind involuntarily summoned the gallery window, the portrait at dawn, but he forced the thought away. "Explain." She gestured toward the wall where a framed canvas hung. It depicted a view of a garden in muted colors, delicate brushwork capturing the play of light on leaves. "I heard movement in her room around midnight," she said, her voice trembling. "I came upstairs to check on her because she had been unwell these past days. I heard her speaking quietly, or rather whispering. When I opened the door a crack, she was standing right there." She pointed to the center of the room, facing the painting as though listening to someone inside it. Moreau approached the canvas. The scene was unremarkable, but the scent of turpentine seemed stronger near it, as though recently touched. He leaned in. The paint was dry, long dry, but there was something odd in the way the shadows were rendered, almost too soft, too inviting. "She stepped forward," Madame Leclerc whispered, "and then she was simply gone." Moreau's jaw tightened. "You saw her vanish?" "I saw her take one step too many," she said, "and I saw her disappear from my sight." He listened without interruption, aware that fear distorts memory as easily as imagination embellishes it. But the room's stillness carried an undercurrent he could not entirely dismiss. He stepped back from the painting and glanced around once more. A faint smear of blue pigment marked the floor near the bed. He crouched, touched it lightly. It was fresh. "Did she paint?" he asked. No, Madame Leclerc said. But the man across the hall does, and he visited her last week. Moreau rose, the puzzle tightening around him. A missing woman, a fresh smear of paint, a portrait glimpsed at dawn that refused to leave his thoughts, and a landlady convinced she had witnessed the impossible. Yet Moreau knew better than to believe in impossibilities. There were always explanations. They simply hid themselves behind the first layer of truth. He looked once more at the painting on the wall. The shadows within it seemed to shift slightly, though the air was still. Behind him, the floor creaked. The concierge's account lingered in Moreau's thoughts long after she fell silent, hovering like a half-formed shape in the fog outside the apartment windows. He had heard countless irrational testimonies in his career, witnesses convinced they saw spirits, omens, shadows that transformed into men only to dissolve again. Fear fed imagination, loneliness amplified sound, exhaustion blurred reality. And yet something in Madame Leclerc's eyes made him hesitate before dismissing her entirely. They carried the weight of someone who knew her own limitations, but was nevertheless certain of what she had seen. Certainty and confusion lived side by side inside her, and Moreau recognized that paradox. It was the same one he felt whenever intuition pressed its quiet palm against the back of his thoughts. He stepped deeper into the missing woman's apartment, letting the door fall softly, shut behind him. The sound echoed faintly through the small space, stirring a draft that ruffled the papers on the desk by the window. He moved with slow attentiveness, the kind born from years of reading a room as one reads a confession. The air inside seemed almost to breathe, exhaling a soft trace of lavender, inhaling the sharper scent of turpentine. He approached the window and touched the rim of the teacup. The porcelain was cool, but not cold. Whoever had been here last had not left long before the incident. Through the glass, the fog-muted street looked almost spectral, with only the faint steps of an early newspaper vendor breaking the stillness. Moreau turned back toward the center of the room. A feeling rested there, subtle, atmospheric, impossible to articulate. He sensed it in the indentation on the bed, in the slight misalignment of the chair, in the faintest residue of warmth in the air, like the room had absorbed a final breath from the woman before she vanished. The missing woman. Moreau had not yet spoken her name aloud. Names often brought people back into focus. They tied memory to flesh. He looked around for a letter, a document, anything that would identify her. On the small bedside table lay a folded slip of paper, a rent receipt. Mademoiselle Élodie Gagné. The name settled into his mind as naturally as a new brushstroke on an unfinished canvas. He repeated it internally, allowing it to anchor him to the reality before him. Élodie's belongings were organized with gentle precision. A few books were stacked on the desk, novels mostly, along with a worn sketchbook that showed no clear indication of her own drawings. A scarf hung neatly on a hook near the wardrobe, but the wardrobe itself stood slightly ajar, as if someone had opened it in haste or hesitation. Moreau approached it, slowly pulling the door wider. Inside hung only a few dresses, a coat, and a pair of shoes lined up carefully on the floor. Nothing was overturned, nothing disturbed. Yet the sense of something interrupted hung heavily in the air. He noticed the smallest detail, a faint trail of dust dislodged near the wardrobe's bottom hinge, as though someone had rested their hand there recently. The imprint was delicate, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell Moreau that someone besides the landlady had been in this room within the last day. He crouched again near the blue pigment stain he had seen earlier. It had dried now, but not enough to crack. The color was a deep cerulean, distinct from the muted tones used in the garden painting on the wall. This was not from Élodie's artwork, if she had any. It had come from outside. He stood, turning his attention back to the painting. The scene depicted a quiet, sunlit garden. A stone pathway, a cluster of ivy climbing a trellis, a bench with no figure seated upon it. The colors were gentle, the brushstrokes controlled. It was a peaceful piece of art, but in the dim light of the apartment, it seemed to hold something unsettled behind its serenity. Moreau felt the odd pull again, the same flicker of unease he'd felt staring at the portrait through the gallery window. It was as though the painting was not simply a representation, but a threshold. A sudden knock jolted him from his thoughts. He straightened immediately, instinct guiding him toward the door. When he opened it, the bohemian painter from across the hall stood before him, the man Madame Leclerc had mentioned. His hair was unkempt, his eyes shadowed from sleeplessness or something heavier. The faint scent of turpentine clung to him as naturally as scent clings to a flower. "You're the inspector," he said. Though phrased as a statement, it carried the hesitance of a question. "Inspector Moreau," he replied. "And you are?" "Armand Delacour," the man said. "I heard voices. Thought I should check." His gaze flickered past Moreau into the apartment, without lingering long enough to seem openly intrusive, but long enough to betray familiarity. "Did you know Mademoiselle Gagné well?" Moreau asked. Armand's jaw shifted. "We spoke a few times. Shared the staircase. She was quiet." His voice tightened on the last word, as though holding back an unspoken sentiment. Moreau studied him carefully. The man's shirt cuffs bore faint smudges of dried paint. Multiple colors, as one would expect from a painter, but the distinct cerulean was there too, pressed into the fabric near the seam. Armand noticed Moreau's glance and instinctively crossed his arms, blocking the view. "You visited her last week," Moreau said. Armand nodded slowly. "She borrowed a book. Nothing more." Moreau detected the lie immediately. Not from the words, but from the way Armand's eyes refused to settle, darting to the floor, to the painting, to the window. "What book?" "A collection of poems," Armand said too quickly. Moreau gestured into the room. "May I?" he asked, although he was already stepping aside to let the man in. Armand hesitated only a heartbeat before entering. He glanced around the space with the familiarity of someone who had been there before, though he tried to mask it. Armand's gaze landed on the painting. A flicker of something crossed his expression. Recognition, fear, or perhaps a memory he thought he had buried. "She liked this one," he murmured. "It wasn't hers," Moreau said. "Was it?" "No," Armand replied softly. "She found it in a market. Said it felt lonely." He paused, then shook his head as if chastising himself for saying too much. "She gave it a place on her wall." Moreau stepped closer. "You knew more about her than you're admitting." Armand's shoulders sagged. Whether from guilt or weariness, Moreau could not yet tell. "She had a tendency to draw people in," he said. "She had a quiet way about her, a stillness. You don't encounter that often in this city. Most people clamor to be heard." He swallowed. "Elodie didn't, and somehow that made you want to listen anyway." Moreau watched him closely, noting how Armand's fingers twitched near his cuffs, as though itching to hide the paint stains. "When did you last see her?" "2 nights ago," Armand said after a pause. "She passed me on the stairs. She seemed distant, distracted, as though listening to something no one else could hear." The air in the room tightened. Moreau allowed the silence to stretch, giving Armand the chance to fill it if he felt compelled. The man did not. Instead, he stepped back, clearly eager to end the conversation. "If there's nothing else, Inspector—" "Ah, there is," Moreau interrupted. "Where were you last night between 11 and 1? Armand stiffened. "In my studio. Alone." Convenient, Moreau thought. And typical. Artists often worked strange hours, making alibis difficult to corroborate. But something in Armand's demeanor, his guardedness, his half-glances toward the painting, suggested more than simple nervousness. Moreau let the man leave, watching his retreating figure disappear down the corridor. When he closed the door again, the room seemed to exhale once more, as though easing out tension that had been trapped inside it. He walked slowly across the wooden floor, letting his fingertips brush the edge of Elodie's desk. A faint draught stirred from the window, rustling a slip of paper tucked beneath a book. He pulled it free and found a small note written in delicate script. The message was brief, unsigned, trembling with emotion. "Meet me where the shadows fall softest." Moreau read it twice. The phrasing was poetic, almost romantic, but held a hint of fear beneath its elegance. Shadows could comfort, or they could conceal. He slipped the note into his coat, aware that it might represent the only direct clue Elodie had left behind. His eyes drifted once more to the painting. The garden's shadows seemed deeper now, as though retreating into themselves. He approached and placed his hand lightly on the wooden frame. The chill of the canvas radiated through his fingertips, unnervingly cold for a room that held such warmth only moments before. As he stepped back, the apartment felt suddenly emptier, as though Elodie's absence had widened into something larger, an emptiness that reached beyond the walls, into the echoing hallways, the fog-drenched street, the quiet morning stretching out beyond the windows. Something had happened here, something deliberate, something intimate. The room was not just left behind, it had been left breathing. The staircase outside Elodie Gagnier's apartment creaked beneath Moreau's shoes as he descended, each step echoing faintly through the narrow shaft of the building. The walls were thin, the kind one finds in older Parisian dwellings where tenants know each other's habits purely through sound. Footsteps, late-night coughs, the slow scraping of a chair, the soft sigh of a window opening to the street. As he reached the second-floor landing, Moreau paused, listening. A faint hum drifted through the corridor, the sort made by someone singing under their breath, though no words shaped themselves from the vibration. It could have been the boiler, or a neighbor behind a closed door, or even a trick of the old building settling under the weight of the morning. And yet it seemed to pulse with the same unsettling cadence that had shadowed the case since he first stepped into Elodie's room. When he emerged onto the street, the fog was beginning to thin, revealing the muted outlines of the neighborhood. Early vendors were setting up their carts. A few students hurried past toward the university, scarves wrapped tightly around their throats, heads bowed against the chill. Moreau turned his collar against the wind and began walking, letting instinct pull him into the rhythms of the city. He had learned long ago that Paris spoke to those willing to listen, through its cobblestones, its riverbanks, its secret courtyards, its cafes humming with gossip. Somewhere in that conversation, a detail would surface. He made his way toward a cafe on Rue Bonaparte, where he knew the artists, writers, and night wanderers gathered between sunrise and noon. The kind of place where no one slept normal hours, and where last night's paint stains often still clung to a man's cuffs. When Moreau pushed the door open, a small bell chimed, its delicate sound swallowed almost immediately by the thick aroma of coffee and pipe smoke. The interior was dim, lit by 2 kerosene lamps placed on opposite corners of the room. A few patrons sat hunched over their cups, eyes heavy, gazes distant. The cafe owner, a round man with a graying mustache, looked up and gave a curt nod of recognition. "Inspector?" he murmured, polishing a glass. "You're early today." Moreau glanced around. "Is Armand Delacour here?" The owner hesitated, eyes flickering toward a shadowed corner of the room. Moreau followed the glance and spotted the painter sitting alone, shoulders curled inward, a cup untouched before him. His hands were clasped tightly on the table, knuckles pale. He wore the same paint-stained shirt from earlier, though now he had pulled on a vest that only partially concealed the marks on his cuffs. Moreau approached without announcement, pulling out the chair opposite him. Armand looked up, startled, though not entirely surprised. His eyes carried the weary glaze of someone who had not slept since the night before. "I didn't expect you so soon," the painter said quietly. "You didn't give me a reason to delay," Moreau replied. "We didn't finish our conversation." Armand exhaled slowly. There wasn't much left to say. Moreau leaned forward slightly, letting silence draw the man's true thoughts to the surface. It did not take long. "I shouldn't have gone into her room," Armand murmured. "I know how it must appear, but I wasn't trying to hide anything." "Then why hide your familiarity with her?" Moreau asked. Armand's jaw tightened. "Because people gossip. They see a painter speaking to a young woman and think they know the story. I didn't want her to be reduced to rumors." "Rumors often hold keys," Moreau said softly. Armand looked away, eyes drifting toward the door as though imagining Elodie walking through it. "She was gentle," he whispered. "Not fragile, never that, but gentle in the way people become when they've lived quietly with something unresolved inside them. I could never tell what it was, only that she carried it with her like a hush." Moreau studied him. "You mentioned she seemed distracted the last time you saw her." "Yes." Armand swallowed hard. She kept looking over her shoulder, listening, as if someone had whispered her name from another room. The cafe owner approached discreetly, placing a fresh cup of coffee on the table for Moreau before retreating. The steam curled upward like a small ghost. Moreau wrapped his hands around the cup, absorbing its warmth. "Did she ever speak of anyone troubling her?" he asked. Armand hesitated. "She mentioned a man once. Only once. She didn't give a name. She simply said she had made a promise she wasn't sure she wanted to keep." "What kind of promise?" "I don't know. She didn't say." His fingers tightened around the handle of his own cup. But she didn't look frightened when she spoke of him, just conflicted. Moreau considered the words. Conflicted was the sort of feeling that lodged itself deep into a person's actions, guiding them without their awareness. A promise could tether a person to hope or to fear, sometimes both. "Tell me about the nights leading up to her disappearance," he said. Armand nodded slowly. "She stopped coming downstairs in the evenings. I would hear her awake at odd hours. Footsteps, sometimes pacing. Once she opened her door and stood in the hallway as though debating whether to speak to me. But then she went back inside." His voice lowered. "And the night before she vanished, I heard something like a cry, not fear, more like surprise." The detail struck Moreau with quiet force. A cry of surprise could mark the moment someone realized they were no longer alone, or when they understood something too late. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Moreau asked. Armand's gaze dropped to the floor. "Because I knew how it would sound. I didn't want to be suspected of something I didn't do." "You're not helping yourself by holding back," Moreau said gently. Armand nodded, resigned. "I know." A long moment passed, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then Moreau shifted the conversation. "You wear cerulean on your cuffs," he said. "The same shade I found on her floor." Armand pressed his lips together. "For a heartbeat." He said nothing. Then the truth broke through his restraint. "She was painting," he whispered. Moreau's brow lifted. "I thought she was not an artist." "She wasn't," Armand said. "Not in the traditional sense, but she had been working on something she wouldn't let me see. Every time I asked, she covered it or turned it away." His voice trembled with a memory he had tried to deny. "And the last time I visited her, she had paint on her hands." The revelation shifted the ground beneath the investigation. If Elodie had been painting, then the fresh pigment did not point only to Armand. It pointed to a secret she had kept hidden, even from those closest to her. "What was she painting?" Moreau asked. "I don't know," Armand said, "but she told me she felt watched while she worked, as though someone were standing behind her, guiding her." A chill crawled up Moreau's spine, not from the idea of a haunting, but from the psychological truth behind such sensations. People under strain often projected their turmoil onto shadows and corners. Yet sometimes that strain came from real pressure. "And the painting in her room?" Moreau asked. "The garden," Armand inhaled sharply. She didn't paint that, but she stared at it often, too often, as though she expected something to change inside it. Moreau felt the pieces shifting, aligning, a woman painting something in secret, a borrowed canvas on her wall, a visiting man, a promise, a cry in the night, and a portrait in a gallery window whose gaze had followed him at dawn. When he finally rose from the table, Armand looked as though he wanted to say more, but lacked the courage or the clarity to continue. Moreau paid for the coffees and stepped into the street. The fog had nearly lifted, but the air still held the weight of something unresolved. He began walking toward the Pont Saint-Michel, toward the gallery where the portrait waited. Paris murmured around him in low, indistinct tones, as though the city itself sensed the investigation deepening. The man with paint on his cuff had told the truth, but not all of it, and whatever truth he withheld was now pressing against the edges of the case like a hand knocking softly on a door. The Pont Saint-Michel rose before Moreau like an old acquaintance, one that revealed nothing and remembered everything. Its stone arches carried a stillness that morning, as though the city's pulse ran deeper beneath the surface, hidden from those who walked above it. As he crossed, the Seine whispered faintly below, the current slipping past with a soft insistence. The gallery came into view on the opposite bank, its windows catching what little light broke through the thinning fog. Moreau felt the same quiet pull he'd experienced before, a tug not of curiosity but of recognition, as though an unfinished conversation awaited him inside. The bell above the gallery door chimed weakly when he pushed it. Open. The interior smelled of varnish, aging wood, and the faint mustiness of canvases that had spent their lives absorbing other people's breath. Paintings lined the walls in close succession, landscapes, portraits, still lifes, each lit by small brass lamps that cast warm halos upon the frames. The atmosphere was hushed, reverent, as though each painting were a parishioner kneeling in silent devotion. A tall, thin man with a neatly trimmed beard emerged from behind a curtain of burgundy velvet. He wore a waistcoat that had once been elegant, but now bore the soft fraying of years of handling art. His expression carried the wary poise of someone used to visitors who admired without purchasing. "Good morning," he said. "You're here early." "I prefer early," Moreau replied. "And I'm looking for information about one of your pieces." The man lifted an eyebrow. "Which one, Inspector?" Moreau gestured toward the painting he had seen through the window. It stood on an easel slightly angled toward the street, just as before. The young woman's gaze met his with the same unnerving intensity. Even in the dim interior light, she seemed awake. "That one," Moreau said. The gallery owner hesitated, a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, yet too precise to miss. "It is not for sale," he said. "I'm not here to buy it." "Then what is your interest?" Moreau stepped closer to the portrait. The woman's face was illuminated by a warm glow from the lamp above, the brushwork revealing delicate textures he had missed earlier. The line of her jaw, the faint tension around the eyes, the way her hair drifted slightly out of frame, all held a naturalness that defied the medium. She looked almost caught in motion, as though someone had turned swiftly and captured her expression mid-thought. "I'm investigating a disappearance," Moreau said softly, "and I believe this painting may be connected." The gallery owner's fingers twitched ever so slightly at his sides. "A disappearance. A tenant from Rue des Fossés Saint-Jacques vanished last night. The circumstances are unusual, and I saw this painting just before receiving the telegram." Moreau's voice remained even, unhurried. "Who painted it?" The owner folded his hands behind his back. "It came from a private seller. No name was attached." "No signature?" "None." Moreau examined the lower corner of the canvas. Indeed, it bore no signature, no date, nothing but the brushstrokes themselves. It was odd, uncommon certainly, not unheard of, but a portrait of this quality typically announced its creator. "Why was it sold anonymously?" Moreau asked. The owner straightened with a stiffness that revealed caution more than indignation. Some clients prefer discretion. Perhaps the painter was embarrassed by his earlier work. Perhaps a collector liquidated a portion of his holdings quietly. The art world often prefers shadows to sunlight. Moreau studied him. And how long have you had it? 3 days. The timing tightened something in Moreau's chest. 3 days. Elodie's growing tension, her sleepless nights, the changes observed by Armand, all fell within that same quiet span. Were there other works sold from the same collection? Moreau asked. The owner hesitated again. 1 or 2? Where are they? Not here. The ambiguity was deliberate. Moreau sensed it like the shift in wind before a storm. He turned back to the portrait, allowing silence to press upon the moment. The woman's expression seemed to thicken with meaning the longer he looked. Her eyes, dark and direct, held a flicker of apprehension, an emotion just shy of imploring. She resembles someone, Moreau said. The owner's breath caught, a small involuntary sound. Moreau turned. You noticed it too? The man shook his head too quickly. No, it's a coincidental likeness. To whom? No one, the owner insisted. It is simply a face, a painting. But his tone betrayed him. Moreau stepped closer, but not aggressively, rather with the quiet insistence of someone who had spent decades reading the subtle shifts of liars. Tell me, he said. The owner swallowed. There was a woman who used to visit the gallery, he said reluctantly. Months ago, she would come in during slow hours and walk the rooms. She moved as though searching for something, though she never said what. He paused, choosing his next words with care. She looked remarkably like the woman in that painting. Did she ever buy anything? No, she barely spoke, but she returned 5 or 6 times. He rubbed the back of his neck. When this painting arrived, I noticed the resemblance immediately. When did she stop coming? Moreau asked. The owner frowned. 2 or 3 weeks ago, her visits simply stopped. Moreau felt the weight of the pattern forming, a soft but steady pressure settling into place. Did she ever give you a name? No. But you remember her face? I do. Moreau approached the portrait again. The painted woman seemed to hold a secret in the tension of her jaw. Not fear, but restraint, like someone who had decided to bear something alone. A faint rustle drew Moreau's attention to the back of the gallery. The velvet curtain shifted slightly, disturbed by a draft or by something behind it. The owner stiffened, turning too sharply. What is behind the curtain? Moreau asked. Storage, the man said quickly. Nothing relevant. Would you mind showing me? The owner hesitated. It is disorganized, difficult to navigate. That's all right. I've stepped into worse. The owner's resistance wilted. He sighed, lifted the curtain and gestured for Moreau to enter. Behind it lay a small, cluttered room lit weakly by a single hanging bulb. Canvases leaned against each other like tired witnesses waiting for their turn to speak. Crates stacked beside them bore chalk markings that had smeared with time. Dust floated in thin shafts of light. What am I looking for? The owner asked nervously. Moreau moved slowly through the space, letting instinct, not logic, guide him. His fingertips brushed the edges of frames, the cold metal handles of drawers. He studied the stored paintings, not closely, but with the trained eye of someone searching for what felt out of place rather than what was traditionally suspicious. Then he saw it. A frame smaller than the others, tucked behind a stack of forgotten canvases. Not hidden exactly, but pushed aside with an almost deliberate casualness. The paint on its edge was cracked in a way that suggested age, yet the front of the canvas was turned toward the wall as though avoiding the room. Moreau gently pulled it forward and turned it around. Another portrait, another woman, and the same eyes, the same haunting gaze. Not identical. This version was younger, painted with softer lines. but the resemblance was undeniable. The owner's words returned to him, a woman who visited the gallery, searching for something. Moreau felt that subtle tug again, that whisper at the edge of comprehension. Was this sold by the same person? He asked. The owner stared at it, pale. I believe so. And why was it not displayed? Because it unsettled people, the owner confessed. Those who saw it felt watched, as though the portrait were alive in a way no painting should be. Moreau looked from the hidden portrait to the one on the easel. A thread connected them, emotional, perhaps psychological, but undeniable. Whoever painted these had known their subjects intimately. Too intimately. He set the second portrait down and stepped back into the main gallery. Outside, the fog had thinned enough for the morning light to begin its slow rise. The river shimmered faintly in the growing brightness. Moreau turned toward the gallery owner. "I'll need the name of the seller," he said. "I told you, there was no name." Moreau's gaze sharpened. "Then I will need the envelope, the one that came with the paintings. They never arrive without one." The owner's resolve broke. He retrieved a folded piece of paper from a drawer behind the counter. It was unremarkable. Cream-colored, worn at the edges, bearing no sender's name. But Moreau unfolded it with the caution of a man turning over a fragile truth. Inside was a single line written in slanted, elegant script, "Where the light fails, the truth begins." The words chilled him more than the morning air. He slipped the note into his coat, turned once more toward the painted gaze of the woman in the portrait, and felt, for the first time in the investigation, that she was not merely looking at him. She was waiting for him. By the time Moreau left the gallery, the morning had taken on a clearer, sharper light, as though Paris had finally decided to reveal itself after lingering too long in a dream. The air still tasted of moisture from the fog, but the clarity changed the shapes of things. Balconies that once looked ghostly now appeared dignified. Lamp-posts regained their familiar iron stiffness. The river, moving with quiet resolve, shed its silver shroud and showed the darker green beneath. But Moreau felt none of the usual comfort that came with the city's awakening. The two portraits weighed heavily in his thoughts, the one in the window and the hidden one in the storage room. Their eyes, nearly identical in their quiet watchfulness, seemed to follow him now, not just from behind glass, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere threaded through the investigation itself. He turned toward the Odeon district, where Madame Leclerc had mentioned a concierge who claimed to have seen something the night Élodie vanished. Witnesses in her position rarely sought out inspectors. They usually avoided involvement unless compelled, which meant this woman's fear, or her certainty, was strong enough to push her forward. And people who acted out of fear tended to speak more honestly than those who acted out of pride or self-preservation. The narrow streets leading toward the courtyard were lined with shops still opening for the day. Bakers swept their doorsteps, their aprons dusted with flour that caught the light like frost. A stray cat lingered by a butcher's window, its tail twitching with expectation as the butcher sprinkled crumbs near the step. Moreau's footsteps echoed along the stones with a soft, deliberate rhythm. He replayed the gallery owner's words in his mind. A woman who looked like the portrait. A promise, a disappearance, and that unsettling line from the envelope. Where the light fails, the truth begins. He reached the archway leading into the courtyard. Sunlight struggled to enter, filtered through the narrow opening at an angle that illuminated only the upper floors. Below, the space remained cool and shadowed, the cobblestones perpetually damp as if the courtyard had never fully dried from decades of rain. Moreau scanned the windows lining the walls. Laundry hung from some, pots of wilted flowers rested on others, and one shutter creaked quietly, nudged by a faint draught that seemed too gentle to come from the wind outside. The concierge was waiting just inside her small lodge near the entrance. She stood when she saw Moreau, smoothing down her dark wool skirt with nervous hands. Her hair was pulled tight beneath a black kerchief, and her eyes were wide, alert, and shadowed by worry. She gestured for him to step inside. "I didn't know if you would come today," she said, her voice a low murmur, as though afraid the walls themselves might listen. "I prefer not to delay when someone has information," Moreau replied, removing his hat and holding it politely at his side. "You told Madame Leclerc you saw something the night Mademoiselle Gagné disappeared." The concierge nodded and closed the door behind them. The lodge was cramped, filled with the faint scent of starch and wood polish, with a small stove warming the room. A newspaper lay folded on the table, unread. "I didn't want to speak out of turn," she said, wringing her hands. "But I couldn't sleep after what I saw. It kept pressing on me, heavier each hour, until I felt I would lose my mind if I didn't tell someone." "Tell me what happened," Moreau said gently. The concierge swallowed and looked toward the window that faced the courtyard. "It was late, perhaps midnight. I was preparing to go upstairs when I heard footsteps. Soft ones, not hurried. The kind you hear when someone is trying not to be noticed." "From where did the footsteps come?" "From the far end of the courtyard," she whispered. "Near the stairwell that leads to the back apartments. I thought at first it might be one of the young tenants returning home late, but when I looked out I saw a figure descending the stairs." "Could you identify them?" "No," she said immediately. "The light was too dim. Only the lamp above my door was lit. But I saw the silhouette, someone tall, and they were carrying something under their arm." "What kind of something?" Moreau pressed. The concierge moved her hands as though holding an invisible object. "Long, rectangular, maybe 1/2 meter wide, wrapped in cloth or paper. I couldn't see clearly. But what struck me, Inspector, was the smell." "The smell." "Turpentine," she whispered, strong enough to drift all the way to my window. Moreau felt a quiet shiver trace the edges of his thoughts. Turpentine again. A recurring scent in Elodie's apartment, on Armand's cuffs, and now trailing a midnight figure through a shadowed courtyard. "Did the figure see you watching?" he asked. "I don't think so. They kept their head down, but—" She hesitated. There was something else. Moreau waited. "A sound," she said softly. "A faint scraping, as if something inside the bundle shifted against the frame." She shook her head. "I thought I imagined it, but it chilled me, Inspector. It wasn't the sound of wood on wood. It reminded me of fabric brushing skin." Moreau's breath stilled for a moment. Witnesses often exaggerated, but this woman was not dramatic. Her words trembled not with theater, but with memory. "What happened next?" he asked. They walked across the courtyard without speaking, not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. And when they reached the far archway, I blinked and they were gone. "You didn't follow?" "No." She clutched her kerchief. I was frightened and ashamed of my fear, but something about that moment felt wrong, as though I was witnessing something I wasn't meant to see. Moreau nodded slowly. "Has anyone else mentioned seeing a stranger in the courtyard?" "No one," she said. "But the next morning, the stairwell smelled strongly of turpentine. It lingered even after I scrubbed the steps." He set his hat on the table, thinking. The figure's movements aligned with the time frame of Elodie's disappearance, and carrying a wrapped canvas of that size. It was too pointed to ignore. Whoever it was had either taken a painting from her room or brought one to replace something that had been taken. Moreau asked, "Did you ever see the missing woman with visitors? Anyone unusual?" The concierge's eyes flickered. "There was one man," she said after a pause. "He visited twice that I saw. A month ago. Tall, with a dark coat. He spoke very softly, almost too softly. And Mademoiselle Gagné seemed tense after he left." "Did he carry anything?" "A satchel, long enough to hold a narrow canvas, but it may have only been papers." Moreau stored the detail carefully. "Did she ever leave with him?" No, she always watched him go from her window after he left, as if making sure he truly departed. The image stirred something in Moreau's chest. A quiet ache, or perhaps a recognition of the private fears people shielded even from those who noticed them. He stood and approached the window. The courtyard below looked deceptively peaceful, its shadows no longer thick with midnight, yet he sensed the echo of last night's scene lingering like an imprint. "Why didn't you say any of this earlier?" he asked softly. The concierge lowered her eyes. "Because I didn't want to be wrong, or to put an innocent man under suspicion, but last night I dreamed of her face." She touched her chest lightly, and it felt like she was asking me to speak. Moreau offered a gentle nod. He had no patience for superstition, but he understood how conscience spoke in the language of dreams. Before he left, the concierge added one final detail. "There is something else about that stairwell," she said. "Something strange. It leads to a back entrance, a private one. Most tenants don't know it exists." "Where does it lead?" "To an alley behind the row of galleries on the riverfront." The words settled over the room like a heavy curtain. An alley behind the galleries. The figure with the canvas had not simply been leaving an apartment complex. They had been heading toward the river, and toward the portraits waiting in silent rooms. Moreau stepped back into the courtyard, the concierge's words echoing through him with the weight of a hidden truth. The case was shifting, not widening, but deepening, pulling him into a labyrinth beneath the city's surface, where the connections between people and paintings blurred into something more intimate, more dangerous. As he reached the archway, he glanced back. The concierge stood at her window, watching him with the solemn reverence of someone who had entrusted him with a fragile burden. He tipped his hat, and then he walked into the alley behind the galleries where the shadows fell softest, and where the truth, perhaps, was beginning. Montparnasse always felt a little restless at night, but by late afternoon it carried a different mood, one shaped by the lingering smell of ink, wine, cigarette smoke, and drying paint. The district hummed with the unsteady energy of people who lived in pursuit of ideas rather than stability. Moreau did not come here often unless a case demanded it. The cafes teemed with those who spoke too quickly, too loudly, or too poetically to tell truth from performance. But today, the streets seemed to draw him in, each corner murmuring a fragment of something he needed to hear. The concierge's account had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. A figure slipping through shadows with a canvas under their arm, a smell that followed them like a second skin. A stairwell leading to galleries where anonymous portraits exchanged hands under veils of discretion. Every detail pointed toward the city's artistic underbelly, and Montparnasse was its open wound. The cafes were already filling despite the hour. Groups of young painters and writers spilled onto the terraces, their laughter breaking through the air like weak sunlight through clouds. They leaned over tables cluttered with sketchbooks, wine bottles, and coffee cups stained by too many conversations. Moreau stepped into Le Jardin Bleu, a narrow cafe whose blue door and mismatched chairs made it both forgettable and familiar. He chose it for one reason. It was a place where people didn't attempt to impress the police. They simply talked. The barkeep, a stout man with thinning hair and an apron stiff with dried wine, nodded at Moreau with recognition. "Inspector," he said gruffly, pouring a cup of strong black coffee without being asked. "We haven't seen you in some time." "Rumors travel faster than pedestrians," Moreau replied. "I hear this district has been talking." The barkeep gave a low, humorless chuckle. Montparnasse is always talking. Half the artists here speak in riddles, the other half speak in nonsense. And which half knows what happened to Mademoiselle Élodie Gagné? The barkeep paused, his hand tightening briefly around the coffee pot. That hesitation, less than a second, was enough to confirm Moreau's suspicion. The disappearance had reached these tables before it reached the newspapers. "People say things," the barkeep muttered, sliding Moreau's cup across the counter. "But you know how they are. They romanticize everything. A missing woman becomes a tragic muse. A crime becomes a tale they can drink to. What exactly are they saying? The barkeep leaned closer, lowering his voice. That she was part of some movement, not formally, but by association, a group of painters who've been gaining a reputation. Odd reputation. Odd how? They call themselves nothing, he said. No name, no manifesto, is just a circle that meets in different cafes. Some say they're trying to capture more than likeness when they paint. Trying to capture presence. Moreau frowned. Presence? You understand, the barkeep said softly. There's a difference between a portrait that resembles someone and a portrait that feels like someone. He lowered his gaze. People say these painters chase the second kind. Rumors. Always rumors. Yet the portraits Moreau had seen, their uncanny watchfulness, the palpable tension in the brush strokes, made him wonder if there was truth embedded within these tales. Who leads this circle? He asked. The barkeep hesitated again, then reached for a small cloth to wipe the counter unnecessarily. There's a man, he said. No one knows his real name. They call him the acolyte because he used to study under a well-known painter years ago. Some say he broke away, claiming the old ways limited him, that he was searching for something purer, more human. Others say he simply lost his mind. The barkeep shrugged. Depends who you ask. Where can I find him? That depends on the night, the barkeep said. He moves between cafes, mostly around here. But he eyed Moreau carefully. He used to frequent a place on Rue Campagne Première. If the rumors are true, he still does. Moreau lifted the coffee to his lips, letting the bitterness sharpen his thoughts. He did not believe in mysticism, nor in supernatural explanations for human disappearances. But he did believe in obsession, and artists suffered from it as acutely as criminals did, though their tools were brushes instead of knives. An obsession could tether someone to reality so thinly they slipped without realizing. He left Le Jardin Bleu and headed deeper into Montparnasse, weaving through the crowds. The evening light, caught on the edges of the buildings, made their windows shine like half-closed eyes. A busker played a melancholy tune on his violin near a bookstall, his bow gliding across the strings with a desperation that seemed to cling to the air. Moreau reached Rue Campagne Première, a street where studios and cafes intermixed like mismatched puzzle pieces. The buildings here carried a quiet dignity. Even their peeling paint seemed intentional. A sign above a narrow door read, Le Théâtre des Ombres. The name was theatrical, almost melodramatic, but something about it made Moreau pause. Shadows had been following this case from the beginning. Shadows in rooms, shadows in courtyards, shadows behind canvases. And now, here was a cafe that embraced them. He stepped inside. The interior was darker than most cafes, lit by only a few wall lamps shaped like small lanterns. The tables were spaced closely together, allowing conversations to spill from one to another. Painters leaned over their drinks, their fingers stained with pigment. Writers scribbled on torn pages, pausing only to stare at the ceiling as though seeking divine intervention. At a table near the back sat a group of 5 individuals, huddled together in intense discussion. Moreau approached the bartender, a quiet woman with silver strands woven through her hair. "I'm looking for a painter," he said. "They call him the acolyte." She did not look up from arranging glasses, but her hands paused, just briefly enough to betray recognition. "He comes and goes," she said. "Never stays long." "Has he been here recently?" "Last night." The words fell like stones into still water. "Was he alone?" "No," she said. "He was with a woman. She looked unwell." Moreau felt the air thicken. "Describe her." "Thin," the bartender said. "Dark hair, pale. She wore her scarf too tightly as though afraid someone might see her throat. And her eyes. The bartender finally looked at Moreau. They were tired, she said, but alert, like someone who had stayed awake for days watching a door. Elodie. It had to be. The description echoed what he'd already felt from her small apartment. The tension, the fear, the restless pacing. The bartender continued. They argued, she said. Not loudly, but urgently. She kept saying she couldn't do it anymore, that she was being pulled in. He told her she was too close to the threshold to turn away. Moreau's skin prickled. The threshold of what? The bartender shook her head. He didn't say, but he kept glancing toward the paintings on the walls as though they had ears. Moreau's gaze drifted across the cafe. Portraits indeed hung on the walls, moody, dark, each face half lit, half hidden. They were not famous works, but they had a certain intensity, as though painted by someone searching for a way to hold on to a soul rather than a likeness. Did they leave together? Moreau asked. No, she said quietly. He left first. She stayed. I found her sitting alone half an hour later, her hands trembling. Then she stood abruptly and walked out the back door. Toward Rue des Fossés Saint-Jacques? Moreau asked. Toward the river, the bartender replied. Toward the gallery. Toward the portrait. The world around Moreau dimmed to a single line of thought, sharp as a needle. The connection between Elodie and the anonymous paintings had not been accidental. She had been involved with these people, perhaps willingly at first, perhaps unwillingly later. The acolyte, the phrase too close to the threshold, the midnight figure carrying a canvas, the hidden portrait that resembled her younger self. Moreau thanked the bartender and stepped outside. The evening had deepened, and the sky was a pale wash of smoke gray. People moved in small clusters, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. As he walked, he replayed Elodie's whispered note. Meet me where the shadows fall softest. The shadows here were long, yes, but they were not soft. Soft shadows lived somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere that waited for him still. His path turned toward the river bank, toward the undercurrent of truth that ran beneath the city's surface. Montparnasse had given him what he needed, not answers, but direction. And now the shadows would guide him the rest of the way. Night fell more quickly than Moreau expected, as though the day had been too weary to linger. The lamps along the Seine flickered to life one by one, casting trembling halos across the water. Moreau watched them from the embankment near Pont-Neuf, his thoughts drifting along the river's currents. The shadows of Montparnasse had led him here, toward the heart of the city, toward a truth he sensed was neither grand nor grotesque, but intimate in a way that made him wary. Intimate truths could wound more deeply than crimes of passion. He turned toward the address scribbled on the note he had taken from the gallery owner's drawer, an unassuming building tucked behind Rue de Seine, hidden between a small bookshop and an abandoned tailor's atelier. Its façade bore no sign of anything unusual. Shuttered windows, peeling paint, a crooked gutter. But he knew from experience that the city's most unsettling secrets often lived behind mundane doors. The concierge here was a thin, stooped man who smelled faintly of onions and candle wax. He blinked up at Moreau when the inspector introduced himself. "You're the second person to ask about the attic this week," the old man muttered, wiping his hands on his apron. "Who was the first?" The concierge shook his head, uneasy. Didn't give a name, but he had the sort of eyes that study a room as though they're measuring it for escape. Tall, dark coat, clean boots. Didn't belong here. The acolyte, Moreau thought. Did he go upstairs? He asked. I told him the attic was locked. The concierge paused, but the next morning the lock looked tampered with. Moreau's pulse tightened, but he maintained his steady demeanor. May I see the attic? The man hesitated, chewing the inside of his cheek. If you wish. But it's cold up there, and crowded. He handed Moreau a heavy iron key, its teeth worn from decades of turning tumblers. Moreau ascended the narrow staircase, the kind that made a man feel too large, too solid for old Parisian walls. The climb seemed endless, each step groaning as though it remembered every tenant who had carried secrets up the same path. When he reached the final landing, he found the attic door. The lock was indeed scraped, the metal faintly scarred. Someone had attempted to force it without success. Moreau inserted the key and turned it slowly. The mechanism resisted at first, then relented with a reluctant click. He pushed the door open. Dust greeted him in a wave, swirling into the narrow beam of moonlight that slipped through a small circular window. The room was cold, far colder than the rest of the building. The air carried the scent of turpentine, old wood, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like the residue left behind from long-handled brushes and forgotten tools. Canvases leaned against the walls in uneven stacks. Some were covered in cloth, others were bare, their surfaces blank or cracked. Wooden crates sat huddled in corners like old soldiers resigned to their fate. The ceiling sloped sharply, forcing Moreau to lower his head as he moved. He stood still for a moment, allowing the quiet to settle around him. The light from the window formed a thin, pale circle on the floor, like a spotlight in an abandoned theater. Dust drifted through it slowly, as if afraid to disturb whatever presence lingered beneath. He stepped inside fully. The room reacted, not with sound, but with atmosphere. The cold deepened. The silence became heavier. Paintings exhaled their long-held secrets. Moreau's heart beat steadily, controlled, but his breath shortened slightly. He recognized that sensation, a place remembering something it wanted to forget. He went to the nearest canvas and pulled the cloth away. A portrait, a woman. Not Elodie, but someone who resembled her in the way siblings resemble one another through shared bone structure and unresolved emotion. Her expression was serene yet unsettled, her eyes fixed on something beyond the frame. Moreau moved to another. This one showed a younger face, perhaps 15, perhaps 20, painted with softer strokes, as though the artist feared to define her too sharply. He set the cloth aside and studied the paintings. They formed a progression, almost a chronology of emotion. The first, youthful melancholy. The second, contemplative longing. The third, restrained fear. Each canvas deepened in intensity, as though emotion itself had thickened the paint. Then he reached the fourth. This one froze him. Because it was Elodie, without question. Her likeness was too precise, too intimate. The artist had not captured her appearance alone. They had caught the way she held her breath at the end of a thought. The slight tension in her jaw, the quiet fatigue in her eyes, the way her lips pressed together as though guarding a secret. The painting radiated something that went beyond craftsmanship. It felt alive, alive in the same way the portrait in the gallery had been alive. Moreau touched the frame lightly. The wood was cold. He moved further into the attic and noticed something strange. A large shape draped in linen, taller than the other canvases. He approached it cautiously. His footsteps echoed in the hollow room, soft but deliberate. He gripped the cloth. Before lifting it, he paused, not out of fear, but because he understood that whatever lay beneath could shift the entire trajectory of the case. Some truths were not violent, but irreversible. This felt like one of them. He lifted the cloth. The canvas revealed beneath was enormous, almost floor to rafter. The painting was unfinished, the brush strokes rough in some places, exquisite in others. It depicted a dimly lit room not unlike the attic itself. At its center stood a woman, Elodie, unmistakably, but she was not painted in a static pose. She was turning toward something outside the frame. Her hand was reaching out, fingers extended as though grasping the edge of another world. Behind her, Moreau leaned forward. The shadows behind her formed the faint suggestion of a second figure, not fully drawn, not fully human, more like a presence, a memory, a man composed of blurred strokes leaning toward her. The acolyte. Moreau's breath slowed. He examined the lower right corner and found at last a signature, small, delicate, written in looping script, A.D. Armand Delacour. The paint on the signature was dry. Not freshly dry, but dry enough that it had been completed days ago, possibly a week. Moreau closed his eyes briefly. Armand had lied. Not about everything, but about the most important part. His involvement with Elodie stretched far deeper than borrowing books or exchanging idle pleasantries. Yet something else struck him harder than the revelation of the painter's identity. The emotion captured in the unfinished strokes. The longing, the fear, the sense of inevitability. There was no malice in the paint, only desperation. He stepped back, the truth settling. Then he heard it. A sound, soft, barely audible. A creak from the ceiling beams above, or footsteps on the roof, or simply the house adjusting to cold. But Moreau knew better. His instincts tightened. Someone had been here recently. Someone might still be here. He turned slowly. A faint glimmer on the floor caught his eye. A discarded brush, its bristles stained with cerulean blue. Fresh cerulean blue, the same pigment from Elodie's room. He crouched and touched it. The paint smudged faintly onto his glove. Not old, hours old. Someone had been painting here the night before. Perhaps even at dawn. Perhaps even while Moreau watched the portrait from the gallery window. He rose. The shadows of the attic stretched long across the floor, reaching toward him like the remnants of a story not yet told. This room held the truth, but it was not finished. Like the canvas, like the turning figure of Elodie, like the unresolved presence behind her. Moreau stepped back to the center of the attic, his breath steady once more. There was one chapter left to unfold, and it waited for him somewhere between the shadows and the light. The sky above Paris held the pale, bruised color that lingers just before dawn, when the city lies between exhaustion and awakening. Inspector Moreau crossed the Pont Saint-Michel with slow, deliberate steps, each one echoing the weighted clarity that had settled over him since leaving the attic. The river below slipped quietly beneath the arches, its surface reflecting a thin strip of light like the first tentative stroke of a painter uncertain about committing color to canvas. The day felt fragile, as though anything too sudden, a shout, a slammed door, even a breath taken too sharply, might break it. The gallery stood ahead, its window still dim, the kerosene lamp inside burning faintly. The same lamp that had drawn his eye 2 mornings ago, the same glow that had framed the portrait in that strange, haunting light. He paused outside, not because he expected something to confront him from within, but because he felt the case gathering around him like the closing of a circle. Everything had led back to this place, and he knew that entering it again would settle something inside him, not with triumph nor revelation, but with the quiet acceptance that accompanies all human truth. He opened the door. The bell chimed softly, subdued as though even it understood the gravity of what awaited. The gallery owner looked up from a desk cluttered with papers, his eyes wide the moment he recognized Moreau's expression. Fear flickered through them, fear not of the police but of the answers he had avoided confronting in his own mind. "You found something," the owner whispered. "I found many things," Moreau said. He removed his hat, holding it at his side. But answers are never as clean as the canvas they hide behind. The owner swallowed, glanced toward the portrait on the easel. "You believe she is connected to the missing girl?" "I no longer believe," Moreau said quietly. "I know." He stepped toward the painting. Her eyes, Elodie's eyes, met his with the same steady, unblinking recognition. Yet now, after standing in the attic among the unfinished canvases, the resemblance felt deeper than mere physical likeness. It felt lived. The portrait captured her the way a memory captures a person. not in their appearance alone, but in the quiet ache behind their restraint. Moreau said, "This portrait is not a likeness by chance. It is her, or rather, it is who she believed herself to be. Once." The gallery owner's breath trembled. "I didn't know," he murmured. "When it was delivered, I felt something in it. Something unsettling, but art often unsettles when it's honest." Moreau's eyes remained on the portrait. Her presence is in the brushstrokes. Whoever painted this knew her intimately, not as an acquaintance or a casual muse, but as someone who carried her emotions, her secrecy, her longing as though they were his own. The owner whispered, "Armand Delacour." Moreau nodded. "He loved her," the owner said. "Yes," Moreau replied. "But love does not always reveal itself gently. Sometimes it reveals itself through silence, through unfinished gestures, through fears shared too late." The owner stepped closer, lowering his voice to a faint whisper. "What happened to her?" Moreau let the question settle before answering. "She left, not by force, not by violence, by a choice made in a moment when her life felt unmoored." He paused, letting the words breathe. She was not running from a man. She was running from what she believed she was becoming. The gallery owner frowned. "Becoming?" Moreau turned slightly, meeting his eyes. "You saw her here. You said she wandered the gallery as though searching. She was not searching for art. She was searching for parts of herself she had lost long before her disappearance. The paintings in that attic, they were not attempts to capture her beauty. They were attempts to capture her fear, her distance, her quiet refusal to speak of what burdened her." The owner's voice cracked. "Inspector, do you mean she is alive?" Moreau said, his tone gentle but firm. "But she does not wish to be found." A long silence filled the gallery. Moreau continued. "She feared her own reflection, not the one in the mirror, but the one painted by someone who knew her too well. That attic, those canvases, the half-finished portrait of her turning away. They were a confession from both of them, and she could not bear what those paintings revealed, not because they were untrue, but because they were too true." The gallery owner sank into a chair, hands trembling slightly. "Then why leave the paintings here? Why send them anonymously?" "Because she wanted the truth preserved," Moreau said. "Not exposed by the gossip of Montparnasse, not twisted by rumor, but held quietly in a place where someone might one day understand." He approached the portrait once more. The woman's gaze held a renewed softness. Perhaps imagined, perhaps simply perceived differently now that he understood her story. Moreau felt a subtle shift inside him, the kind that came only when intuition and evidence converged into a single, inevitable thread. "She came here before she disappeared," Moreau said. "She stood before this very painting. She saw herself, her younger self, her truer self, alive in the strokes of a man who loved her. And she realized she had become a stranger to both of them." The gallery owner whispered. "And so she walked away. Not into a painting," Moreau said softly, though that is how the concierge perceived it. "Not into thin air, not into a cult or a conspiracy. She walked into her own silence, into a life where she could begin again, free from the shadows of who she once was." He stepped back from the painting. "And Armand?" the owner asked. Moreau exhaled slowly. "He will grieve her absence in the only language he knows, paint. His attic will remain full of unfinished canvases. That is punishment enough for a man like him. I will speak with him, but gently. No crime has been committed except the crime of loving someone more deeply than she could bear." The gallery felt suddenly warmer, as though the portrait itself exhaled with understanding. Moreau took one final look at Elodie's painted face. Her expression no longer unsettled him. It no longer felt like a haunting. It felt like closure. "She left a note," Moreau said, turning toward the door. "A message to a man she once trusted. Meet me where the shadows fall softest. She did not mean a place of darkness. She meant a place without harshness, without judgment, without the glare of expectations. A quiet life in a quiet corner of France, perhaps. A place where she could finally breathe. The owner blinked back tears he made no attempt to hide. Moreau placed his hat gently upon his head. "As for us," he said, "we will honor her silence, and we will let the city forget her name. That is sometimes the greatest mercy." He stepped outside. Dawn had deepened, the light now brushing the rooftops with a wash of pale gold. The fog had retreated, leaving the river clear and steady. Paris breathed around him, alive, restless, eternal. Moreau paused once more on the embankment. The water glimmered. The morning carried a faint chill. The portrait's gaze lingered in his mind, not as an enigma, but as a memory of a woman who had lived in paint because she could not live in peace. He tipped his hat to the Seine, to the city, to the quiet truths that never reached the newspapers. Then he walked on. For some mysteries are not solved. They are simply understood.